Globalization has become the driver of international trade, giving both rich and poorer countries a stake in world business. Then came US President Donald Trump's tariffs. Could they torpedo globalization, and what would that mean? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. Many of us have been learning a lot about economics this week, a crash course forced on us by the actions of one man, US President Donald Trump. The tariffs he's imposed on countries around the world have ripped up trade treaties forged over decades. President Trump says the levies will make America wealthy again. Well, they're certainly making people elsewhere very nervous. Globalization has been the biggest driving force for global trade in modern times, removing barriers to allow business across borders and continents. It's had critics too. Some say it reinforces inequality and makes big corporations richer. So is globalization under threat? What would the end of globalization mean for people in different places? Or can the rest of the world find ways of working around the US and President Trump? We'll talk to our panel of experts in just a moment, but first this report from Victoria Gatenby.
Stock markets have plummeted in the past week, causing panic around the world. That's after US President Donald Trump announced tariffs on dozens of countries, which came into effect on Wednesday. With investors fearing a global recession, trillions of dollars have been wiped off the value of the world's biggest companies. China is now facing US trade taxes of 104%. In return, it's imposed duties of 84% on American goods.
Right now, China's paying a 104% tariff. Think of it, 104%. Now, it sounds ridiculous, but they charged us for many items 100%, 125%. Many countries have. They've ripped us off left and right. But now it's our turn to do the ripping.
Trump's economic policy is centred on taxing foreign companies and governments for access to the US market. The tariffs break with decades of free trade agreements and have left global supply chains in a state of flux. They also put the world's two biggest economies, the US and China, on a collision course.
If the US truly wants to resolve issues through dialogue and negotiation, it should adopt an attitude of equality, respect and mutual benefit. If the US disregards the interest of both countries and the international community and insists on engaging in a tariff war and trade war, China will definitely fight to the end.
Others, including the European Union, which faces tariffs of 20%, are still weighing up how to respond. The bloc says it's looking for meaningful engagement with President Trump. The White House has defended the market slump, saying the numbers are merely a snapshot and will change. But many business leaders say consumers will bear the brunt in the form of higher prices and savings lost from pension funds that invest in stock markets.
We're already seeing is some of the softer data, consumer confidence, corporate confidence already slipping. And that has a lot to do with both the level of tariffs, but also the uncertainty around tariffs and also the uncertainty around other policies. Fiscal policy, rule of law, other sort of dynamics.
And I'm proud to be an American. President Trump says tariffs will make America wealthy again, but many people around the world risk becoming poorer in the process. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, now let's bring in our panel of guests who will explain the complex economics so we all understand it. And in Beijing, we have Shirley Yu, a senior visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. Melanie Brusseler is the US program director at the think tank Commonwealth. She's joining us from State College in Pennsylvania. And in London, Chris Weafer, the CEO of the consultancy Macro Advisory, which focuses on Russia and Eurasia. Welcome to all three of you, and thank you for joining us here on Al Jazeera. Let me start with you, Melanie. We're going to talk about globalization and how this all affects globalization. That's the issue of the day. But first, I want to just look at where things stand. We're now past the 1 week mark since President Trump stood in the Rose Garden of the White House proclaiming Liberation Day. Are we now in a fully fledged trade war?
Yeah, I'd say that today is perhaps a more important day than last week's Liberation Day, just because the tariffs were announced last week but are only being implemented today. I think that there had been a lot of hope amongst financial markets and everyday Americans that this would be rolled back and that it wouldn't be fully implemented. But as of right now, it seems that that is not the case and that Trump is moving forward with these quite aggressive tariffs. In global contracts, we've yet to see how many countries will respond. I think until this point, many countries have been seeking to negotiate with Donald Trump, but have been doing so in a pretty chaotic mood, just because Trump has been quite all over the place in terms of signaling whether or not there was room for negotiation, and if so, what would be even the terms upon which to engage with that by countries. And so I think that today is the real day of reckoning in terms of seeing these being implemented.
So, Shirley, in Beijing, the tariffs on China raised to an amazing 104%. China's not backing down. In fact, they have now put tariffs on US goods up to 84%. Chinese officials saying they will fight to the end. How's this all seen in Beijing? A game of chicken, it seems. Who's going to blink first?
Exactly. It seems like U.S. and China are currently on an economic collision course. And of course, it'll be equally, I think, economically devastating for both countries. In the U.S., I think within a matter of days, consumers are going to feel a sharp price spike on many items that they are routinely purchasing, from fashion to toys to gadgets, electronics to pharmaceuticals. But also within China, export is 20% of China's economy, and the export sector employs 200 million people. And at the same time, we have the U.S., China's export to the United States, although diminishing, still accounting for 15% of China's total export, which translates to 2.3% of China's GDP. So the impact on China is going to be the potential loss of jobs, closure of factories, the exodus of multinationals, and potentially the cost on social stability.
Chris, I've seen some experts saying that China may consider a full decoupling from the United States. Is that a possibility? And can tariffs go any higher? Does it make any sense if they go any higher? Or will all trade just stop?
Well, I mean, what's happened already doesn't make any sense from an economic point of view. A full-blown trade war, the scale of tariffs that we've seen, all of which can risk a global recession, if it continues along this path. And in terms of decoupling, well, I guess it's the question you raised earlier about globalization. Is globalization now over? First of all, bear in mind that globalization as a concept has been kind of at least being questioned since COVID, since 2020. We had massive, of course, global trade disruptions in 2020 because of COVID, and the whole idea or concept of globalization was questioned then.
Okay, let me interrupt you quickly, Chris, if I may, because we're talking about globalization, and I've seen lots of different definitions of what globalization means, because some define it as going way beyond trade, the increasing connectedness of world cultures and economy. What's your view of what the term actually means before we continue talking about it?
Sure. Yeah. No, I don't agree with the idea of expanding it beyond industry and trade. As you say, I think that a lot of people have jumped on the bandwagon talking about cultural exchanges, etc. I think that's a step too far. But globalization, as we're now talking about, means kind of free global trade. It means that you can make a product in any country in the world and sell it to any other country. It means that parts of a particular product are made in some countries, are brought together and assembled in another country and then sold around the world. So it's that free movement of components, of products, of people, of capital. That's, I suppose, the definition of globalization. And that has been under serious threat since COVID, and it's now under massive threat because of what's happening because of US tariffs. We are very likely, in my opinion, to see the end of the discussion about globalization and the emergence of discussion about regionalization, where countries kind of look closer within the regions, within Europe, say China and Asia, and are no longer looking at globalization in the sense that we previously thought, which is global free trade.
Melanie, is it just about free trade? Or, I mean, if you go beyond the modern era, there certainly was an increasingly smaller world for all of recorded history. You could argue with some of the definitions that colonialism was a form of globalization, countries going to other countries to plunder resources.
Yes, certainly. And I think that it's important to note that some of the institutions that are commonly associated with contemporary or more recent globalization were first created during a period of formal colonization. For example, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were formed post-war as part of the Bretton Woods Agreement. And at that time, many countries were still under formal colonial control. I think in terms of thinking about this current moment, it's important to keep in mind that, as you've said, globalization or global trade and global flow of production has been a mainstay of modern economic systems. But I think that what is notable at this moment is that we had a period of global economic restructuring in terms of really concrete building projects, in terms of building out policies and corporate strategies that were centered around this project of globalization. And I think that we're in a moment now where we will be seeing another round of rebuilding. I think that often common understanding of globalization, as we've kind of seen in the 80s and 90s moving into the early 2000s, there's, I think, a kind of common conception that markets are sort of this laser beam of activity and energy, and globalization was a matter of just deregulating that and moving trade barriers, as opposed to globalization being this really active project to build institutions and processes that would allow corporations as main actors to be moving production in a global network, and also states to be intervening in that process as well with their own development strategies. I think there's quite a lot of agency.
Yeah, Melanie, staying with you, I mean, there's an expression, a rising tide lifts all boats, which I've heard in connection with globalisation. But this has not been beneficial to all people around the world, has it? And that's exactly what Trump is arguing. He wants to protect his voters. For example, in the US Rust Belt, where you are. So given his policies, what he's done over the last week, are the steel mills coming back to Pennsylvania, do you think, anytime soon?
No, certainly not. I mean, I think that tariffs in general can be used in an industrial policy toolkit to be supporting manufacturing, both expanding it in a general sense, but also to be undertaking important processes like decarbonization or moving towards higher tech production. But the tariffs that Donald Trump has announced are incredibly aggressive and untargeted, and they're not being met with any other sort of industrial policy that might support investment in manufacturing, such as public financing, public procurement, policies that subsidize consumer demand. And I think, if anything, we're going to be seeing a decrease in demand, just aggregate demand in the U.S. context, because we're moving into a quite chaotic and recessionary moment. I think that what we're most likely to see is that any corporation that had been invested in the U.S. would be quite hesitant to expand production, and most corporations are going to be quite reluctant to invest in the U.S. in general right now, not just production, but just kind of any economic activity, just because the situation is so volatile and so aggressive. I think that even as Trump has been announcing these aggressive tariffs, it's still quite all over the place in terms of what the final state and structure of this is going to look like, if there's room for negotiation, if there'll be any rollback, or if there'll be further policy announcements. I think that for the most part, the business community is going to be quite reluctant to do anything in the U.S. They're going to be taking an approach that's kind of waiting and seeing, and will likely not be making any kind of major investment decisions until there's at least the removal of Trump from office, if not some sort of congressional check on his ability to roll out tariffs.
Shirley, in Beijing, as you look at globalisation, there have been many innovations in recent decades. Air freight connections getting more fast and efficient, containerization, every kind of goods and commodity can be loaded into a shipping container around the world. Then, of course, the big revolution of the last 20 or more years, the internet, email, mobile phones, communications, instant, cheap and efficient, and an integration of supply chains. None of these things can be uninvented, can they?
I agree with you. Globalization is not dead. Globalization, as we understand it, is simply obsolete. The globalization, the question you asked earlier, is actually multifaceted. It involves an integrated global markets for trading goods, a global market for trading services, and also a global market for trade of production inputs, which include talents, capital, but also intellectual properties. So this globalization era post the Cold War has been underpinned in the dollar's global dominance, global physical trading goods, and more importantly, the removal of tariff and non-tariff barriers. And I think the coming era of globalization is going to hinge on AI, cloud, industrial automation, robotics, and also the decentralized global finance. So I think on this very point, Trump and the Xi, they actually see the same vision. China and the US both possess a part of the advantages in this incumbent global industrial revolution. China has the manufacturing capabilities, but the US is really great in leading global technological innovation. So both sides needs to make up for their shortcomings. And in this process, I think a new global trade order will begin to emerge.
Chris, there in London, where you are, officials at the Prime Minister's office in Downing Street said this week, the world has changed. Globalisation is over and we're now in a new era. Your reaction?
Well, I think as our colleague from Beijing had just said, if you look at globalization in the kind of narrow context, which I explained earlier, which is simply about trade and manufacturing in one location, selling to another, then I think that's certainly, well, I hate to use the word dead, but it's certainly, that has materially changed. And we're moving into a different era for sure. But, you know, if we look at what President Trump is assuming in simple terms, he's assuming that if he makes the import foreign-made goods so expensive that U.S. consumers won't buy them or will prefer to buy U.S. manufactured goods, and therefore U.S. companies will move quickly to shut down their overseas operations and start manufacturing in the US. That's in simple terms, I guess, is what he's trying to achieve. But you have kind of an enormous number of assumptions within that. How long it will take? Our colleague from Pennsylvania said that nobody's going to invest while there's so much uncertainty. And you are looking at a period where there is a high risk of a recession in the US, certainly stagflation at best, and probably with a lag the same in other global markets. So in that sense, you know, we are looking at not an efficient transition, as President Trump, I think, would like to assume. We are looking at something that's going to be a global mess for many years. And what comes out of that is yet to be seen. But we are definitely heading for a mess if this situation continues as he has outlined it and the responses that we're seeing from other countries.
Melanie, I was talking about a rising tide earlier on. I'm going to throw another water analogy at you, which I've seen in recent days. Free trade is like water. If there are blockages or obstructions, it will flow around them. Can China, the EU, India and others work around the US?
Yes, so I think that had been the hope of many countries before the full suite of tariffs had been announced. Donald Trump implemented tariffs during his first administration, largely targeted towards China, which I think were relatively tame in comparison to what has been implemented. And the fact that they were only implemented towards China meant that corporations like Apple, which had really heavily invested their productive capacities in China across recent decades, were able to slightly shift their production towards Vietnam and India, sort of rerouting against the tariffs without having to move production to the United States, which would be much more expensive. I think that with these tariffs that have been announced last week, we've seen really, really staggeringly high tariffs imposed upon India, Cambodia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, basically the whole of the region in Southeast Asia. And so I think that it will be much more difficult for corporations like Apple and others that are US helmed but have globalized production to be able to reroute to other countries to be able to still do production in a globalized manner without, moving to the United States. I think that we'll likely see is a question not just for countries but for corporate strategies and planners, to what extent tariffs will be absorbed by their own balance sheets, meaning that they will just simply have lower profits for the time being, whether they'll raise prices that consumers will then be facing. There's some level of negotiation, I think, that Trump has signaled for countries to be increasing their imports of U.S. goods, which can be quite challenging for countries that are more middle income or lower income, just because they might lack the income to be purchasing U.S. goods, or lacking the foreign exchange capacity, which could pose balance of payments issues for them. But I think that in general, we're going to be seeing a lot of creativity, but also quite a lot of difficulty to be able to, on the fly, in a very quick manner, being able to reroute the entire global production and consumption nexus the way that Trump seems to be imagining will happen overnight through these tariffs.
Shirley, on Monday, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that the EU would now focus like a laser beam on the 83% of global trade that's beyond the US. Can you see a kickstart now in trading relations between the EU and China?
Well, EU is one of the largest trading partners for China, actually the second largest right after ASEAN. So as you can see, although China's export to the United States accounts for only 15% of its export total, but actually China exports lots of intermediary products to third countries, with the final market being the United States. And so this morning we already saw that Vietnam launched anti-dumping investigations on Chinese steel products. And so I think there is going to be an increasing effort by the Trump administration to force third countries to potentially impose tariff or non-tariff barriers on Chinese manufacturing in respective markets. And given that being said, EU has proposed a zero for zero tariff regime. But we have to understand what President Trump comes from, what his end game really is. What President Trump wants to have is essentially to raise a tariff so high in order to move global manufacturing back to the United States. And that applies to the EU, which means that a lot of the cutting edge technological and manufacturing industries are going to move from the EU markets back to the United States. Is that a scenario that the EU wants to see? So given that situation, I don't think a zero for zero tariff regime between the US and EU is going to happen anytime soon. So a good proposal for all countries really who are subject to tariffs globally is really to think from the maximizing national interest perspective, to come up with policies that are rational. So therefore for EU, definitely to maintain a strong relationship and a resilient relationship with one of its largest trading partners, that is China, is in its best interest.
Chris, I mean, China has lots of things that it needs to sell. Do you have concerns that there'll be other countries that are worried about China offloading its products on them at cheap prices? And could this then lead to other countries putting tariffs on China? So this whole thing continues and cascades.
Yeah, I think that's the real danger, because we have focused a lot, and there's been a lot of commentary on the US, where essentially the impact will be that imported goods are going to rise significantly in price, adding to US inflation. Probably will cut demand, as our colleagues have said, from US consumers, but there'll be a big lag in the substitution. In other words, the US made alternatives. There'll be a big lag of many, many years. So you really do run the risk both of high inflation in the US and a slowdown in the economy. And if you look at the rest of the world, it's the opposite, where, obviously big manufacturers like China and others who are no longer able to sell their goods to the US will be looking for other markets, essentially, looking to dump them into those markets, where for a short time, European consumers will benefit perhaps from cheaper goods coming in, but EU countries will have to raise barriers to protect their own industries. So you do get a cascade effect. You almost like the opposite effect between the US and say the other big market of Europe and Asia, but ultimately they all end up with the same problem, which is a big reduction in demand, higher prices generally, and a slowdown in the global economy. There's one other factor I'd like to raise. Just you mentioned China, of course. The other issue with China is that China is the biggest source of, I guess, what we're now called critical minerals, rare earth minerals, for the global economy, for the US and Europe. These are materials that are essential in the manufacture of consumer appliances like, say, mobile phones, in the defense industry, and generally in high-tech industries. China has not banned the export, but has put licensing requirements, which effectively will slow down the export of these critical materials to the US. And again, that's another factor I think that needs to be considered. It's not just a case of how long it will take for US manufacturers to return to the US, but when they do, will they actually be able to have the critical materials, particularly in the technology sectors, to be able to continue to make their products and to make them competitively?
Melanie, I'd like to end this discussion on an upbeat note, but I can't think of anything to discuss that's upbeat. Many analysts say a US recession is a strong possibility. How likely is a global recession or global depression now?
Yeah, I think that we're still in quite early days, but it does seem that in the US, at least, we're facing a stagflationary situation where we'll have a recession as well as increasing prices. I think in global context, we'll certainly see a fluctuation in global demand, just because there'll be many countries and consumers that are just reluctant to engage in economic activity, and we're seeing such a dramatic, whipsaw effect in the economy that it will have quite serious effects. But that said, I think that in terms of perhaps being able to end on a hopeful note, I think that Trump's actions are quite aggressive, and they bode so poorly for the U.S. and global economy. But I think that it's also a moment to be putting forward constructive visions of what both the U.S. and global economy can look like post-Trump, just because he will have brought such a wrecking ball to both, that I think that we should be in a position to be thinking about what does economic prosperity, global order, and economic security look like in the 21st century. I think that this is a moment to be really putting forward, hopeful visions into this situation.
You mentioned there stagflation. Worth telling our viewers that is stagnation and inflation at the same time. Very, very grim. Thanks to our guests, Shirley Yu, Melanie Brusseler, and Chris Weafer. Events are moving fast, and so are the markets. Stay tuned to Al Jazeera for continuing coverage with even more analysis on our website, aljazeera.com. What do you think? Post your views on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or use X. Find us at AJ Inside Story. I'll be back here very soon. Until next time, from me, James Bays, and all the team, stay safe. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.